But we all know that at some point later on, things will get more difficult. It will get more challenging. I can promise you this already. So how can you keep this current level of motivation that you have and be able to carry it through to the difficult times? One of the things that I find really helpful is setting goals and having my goals around me, like displayed on the wall while I'm working or while I'm studying. So I created this fantastic worksheet for you so that you can start thinking about why you're doing this. Why are you learning to code? Why are you learning this skill? What will you be able to achieve once you've mastered it? And what would your life look like once that happens? So head over to the next lesson, fill out the sheet with your answers, and then print it out and put it somewhere where you can see it. So that when things become difficult and when your motivation takes a nosedive, you can have a look at it and remind yourself of why you're doing it in the first place. So head over there now.
Khó cho để bật tiếp.
All right, so previously we managed to get our website to include images as well as links. So we added these image tags as well as anchor tags, which can take us to external sites, but also to internal sites, like the brand new My Hobbies page that we created, or the Contact Me. Now in this lesson, we're going to take things a little bit further. In our personal site /CV, I want to have a section where we can list our work experience, so what we've done and when we've done it. Currently, if we went into our code and say below that unordered list and we add a h3, let's call it work experience. Now, so if we added a standard paragraph tag and we said maybe 2010 to 2013, let's say lead developer at Tempo app. So let's save that and take a look. And if we refresh, then it looks like this, which is all well and good if we have that range. But what if I wanted to add something where I didn't have a year range? Say if it was 2010 when I worked as a researcher at Institute of Cognitive Neurosciences. So let's save that and let's refresh. And you can see that it looks really awkward, right? Like this part and this part, they're not really indented at the same level horizontally. And everything just looks really messy. So how can we implement something that looks nice like this, where there's even a bit of padding in between and everything looks really regular? Well, one of the ways that we can achieve this using just HTML is to create a table. So if we have a look at the docs on MDN and we look at table, you can see that a very simple table just looks like this. This is a bog standard simple table. But tables can get really complicated as well, and you can use it to structure and represent data in your website. So we could have table headings, we could have different cells, we could have column groups and columns, we can have captions, and a whole bunch of things. So let's try and add a table to our website so that we can make our CV look a little bit more like this. So let's first add a horizontal rule here between our table and these two links. And let's use autocomplete to add a table tag for us. Inside a table, we can create table rows and also table data, which are essentially like cells. So say if we create a brand new table row, and it's really helpful that AutoSuggest actually tells you what each of these tags are. So let's go ahead and hit enter. So this is a single row. And if I want to create another row underneath, then I would just have to create another TR. Now inside the top row, I'm going to have two table data elements, or rather two cells in this single row. And to represent the cells, I'm going to use the TD or table data element. So the first cell is going to contain my date, and the second cell is going to contain what I did. So that's our first row complete. Now let's go ahead and create another 2 cells or another 2 TDs inside our second row. So let's again copy and paste the date and the work into the table data elements. And I'm going to delete these 2 paragraphs. Let's hit save, go back to our website and hit refresh and see what it looks like. Okay, that's already looking a lot better than before, right? It being a table means that our columns are structured together. So these 2 lines are structured so that they are indented to the same place, and it makes it look so much neater than before. Now, aside from having just rows and cells, tables also have headers, body, and footer, mirroring what we have for our HTML websites. And you can declare them quite simply by writing t-head for table head and t-body for table body and t-foot for table footer. Now, inside the table head, we can add some titles to each of our columns, and they get formatted by default in bold. So if we create a new table row, and inside this row, instead of creating table data or TD elements, we're going to create TH elements, or a table header cell element. And inside here, we're going to give the name of our first column, which is going to be dates. And then we're going to create another table header cell, and this one is going to be the work that we did. So let's hit save and hit refresh, and you'll see that we now have table headings for each of our columns. Now, for those of you guys who might have been playing around with this code, you would have realized that if I cut this table row and instead of putting it inside the header, I actually put it just inside the main table, and I delete all of this, and we hit save and we hit refresh, you'll notice that it looks exactly the same. And that's because we're using these special elements, the table header cell elements, and most browsers know how these should be formatted. So it looks exactly the same. But the reason why we might have different sections of our table, for example, putting these cells inside the table head and putting these inside the body, is because sometimes we might want to select and isolate the table header and the table body in order to style it differently or make it function in a different way. For example, if we separated the table header from the table body, we can use some code to isolate the header and fix it in place so that when users scroll through our table, we can keep these headings on screen. Now, that requires a little bit more fancy stuff like CSS or JavaScript, which we'll wait until later modules to talk about. But it's a good reason to be aware of why you might want to place the header cells inside the head, the main body of the table inside the body, and maybe some footer cells into the table footer. And generally, this is the structure that you'll see for most tables, with a head and with a body. Now, if we have a look at these tables on the MDN developer docs, you can see that they've got outlines, whereas what we've created doesn't have any borders or boundaries or outlines at all. If we take a look at the MDN developer docs for the table element, you can see that there's a whole bunch of attributes, such as background color, or border, or cell padding, cell spacing, and a whole bunch of things that you can apply to the table element to change its appearance. But if you take a closer look at each of these styling attributes, then you can see they all have a little thumbs down sign next to them. And this is because all of these attributes for the table element are deprecated. And you'll hear that word quite often in programming across many different languages and disciplines. And what that word means is that it's almost like it's downgraded. It's something that they no longer recommend you using. And the reason is because we have to always keep in mind that HTML is for structure, CSS is for styling, and JavaScript is for behavior. And even though it's possible to affect the style of your website through using HTML attributes or through using different HTML elements, you have to try and resist when you can. But since we haven't yet learned about CSS, I want to take you to the primitive days before web designers had access to CSS, what they might have done using just HTML. And if we scroll through these attributes, you'll come across something called border. And this defines in pixels the size of the frame that's surrounding the table. We can add this attribute to our table element, not tothead or table row or table heading cell or any of the other ones, because we're currently reading the table docs, remember? And we can add it and say border equals 1 pixel, let's say. And if we refresh our site, then we'll see this incredibly ugly HTML table that you'll see a lot in websites from the 90s. So let's get rid of it. Let's just quickly recap the HTML structure for creating a table. To start off, we create this table tag and we also close it. And everything in between is the actual content of our table. This just creates a simple table. Now, by default, your browser will style the table to not have any borders or padding or anything style related. Now, in order for our table to actually start holding some pieces of data, we're going to have to create something called a table row. And between the open and closing TR tags is where the data for that row is going to go. And this section of code will just create a single row inside our table. Again, with no associated styling. So if there's nothing between these two tags, then you won't actually see anything appear on screen. Now, the next part is our table data, or rather our table cells that we create using the TD tag. And in between the open and closing TD tags, we place the actual data that's going to go into that cell. And this is a single table cell that's going to contain the words Angela, and it's going to go inside the first table row. And so over here. And as you populate your table with more rows and more data, then you will see this structure reflected on your website. So the biggest hurdle that you have to get over is that there are no table columns. All that you're doing is going from top to bottom, defining new table rows. And inside each row, you're putting in individual cells. And each cell gets placed horizontally, one after the other, creating effectively the columns. While the main job of tables is to display structured data, you can also see how you could use it to affect the layout of the various HTML elements on your website. And that's what we're going to look at in the next lesson. Now, the other thing that I want to do with the website is if we have a look at Thomas Corman's site, you can see that he's got his picture on the left and his name and his title and his blurb next to that image. And that's quite a nice layout. So we can do that here as well. We can have our image on the left and all of this on the right next to the image. Now, because if we wanted to only use pure HTML to affect how this part of our website looks, then we can use our tables to do that. So let's go up here where the body of our website begins, and let's add a table. Let's add a table row. And inside this row, it's only going to have 2 table cells or TD elements. And the first TD element is going to contain the image. And the second TD element is going to contain all of this up to the horizontal rule. So let's just cut it and paste it into here. Now we can hit save and let's refresh our page. And you can see that we're getting close to this kind of structure where we've got a single table with only 2 columns and 2 cells, this being one cell and this being the other cell. And that allows us to get this kind of layout for our website. Now you can see here that there's a little bit of a gap between the image and the text, whereas on our site it's right up and next to the image. Now if you wanted to increase that distance, then you can achieve that by changing the table's cell spacing. And if you have a look in the attributes, you can see this attribute called cell spacing, which defines the size of the space between two cells in a percentage value or pixels. So let's go ahead and add some spacing to our table. So inside our table element, we're going to use cell spacing, and let's set it to equal 20 and hit save. And then let's go and have a look. Nice, that looks pretty good, right? So now that we've got books and teaching, or education, and work experience listed in chronological order, the next thing that might be nice to add are listing some of the skills that you have. So I want you, as a challenge, to create a table where you've got an H3 for the skills subtitle, and then you've got all your skills listed in a column on the left, and on the right you've got some rows where you've listed using emojis to show how familiar you are with each skill, ranging from 5-star to 1-star. Once you're done, you should have a website that looks something like this. So you've got your H3 as a subtitle, and then you've got a table that lists your skills as well as the number of stars that you would rate yourself. And to get bonus points, you can also use tables to affect the layout of your skills. So you end up separating your skills into 2 columns and making it look a little bit like this. And this is what you should end up with. Or rather, this is what you're aiming for. So I've added an extra skill so that we have 4 skills. And they are laid out side by side so that there's 2 columns of these skill sets. And it's really important to note these 2 sections should be distinct from each other. So if you added a 1 pixel border, this is the structure that you will see. 2 sets of skills side by side, distinct from each other. So if you want to give that challenge a go, then this is a good time to pause the video and give it a try.
Sao tao mất tiếng rồi? Alo.
Video đâu cái là bài viết mà.
All right, so how did that go? The first thing that we have to do is, of course, add our H3, and we're going to do that right above the horizontal rule, which is here, and below our table, so right here. And we're going to create something that's called skills, and then we need to make a new table. And this table is not going to have any headings because we don't have any headings over here, but it is going to have some rows and some columns. So let's make our first row using TR, and let's list our first skill inside a TD. And let's say iOS development. And then we can put our stars in a second TD that's going to be right next to our first TD in our second column.
Sao đấy?
Mặt mày yếu à?
Right next to our first TD in our second column.
Chắc do mặt mày yếu rồi. Ê mày lướt bên content tao xem cái.
Ồ,
Alo alo, mạng mày yếu hả?
tụi đi con đấy. Sao? Thấy không? Thấy không?
Thế à.
Ok thế rồi.
And we're just gonna add in a star, which I'm gonna copy and paste. And
Copy
now,
đâu
to
nhỉ?
save
Nó copy
time,
cái
I'm
star
just
đâu
gonna
nhỉ?
copy
Chính cái tà đấy. À, nhập vào đâu à?
Nó copy cái mấy cái sao ở đâu á?
Đây này, cái bài trước đây. Cái bài trước đây, đây này.
Cái đoạn Unicode.
Đây này.
Cái trang Unicode.
Đây, đây cái bài này này. Ở Windows thì bấm bật cái này lên. Hai là bấm Win cộng với lại phẩy, hoặc là Win cộng với lại chấm phẩy, thì nó ra cái bảng này mình chọn đấy.
Ok ok.
the row. Now, whenever you're programming and you find yourself doing a lot of copy and pasting, then you're probably doing something wrong. Now, in order to save time, you'll see me do it quite a lot, and it's because it's not very fun for you to watch me writing TR and TD all day long. But when you're coding yourself, ideally try and avoid copy and pasting, and when you do, always make sure that you
Hả?
Hả?
Có bật đâu?
Vừa tắt rồi, nãy mới bật.
understand what you're copy and pasting, and also make sure you check for any bugs and errors that you introduce. So let's edit some of these things. All right, cool. Let's hit save and let's check it out. Looks pretty neat, right? All right, so now let's tackle bonus points. If you've given it a go and you've managed to do it, then really well done. It takes a little bit of researching around and a little bit of lateral thinking in order to get it working. But if you haven't, or if you want to find out how one might do it, then take a look now. Essentially, what we're trying to achieve here is very similar to what we've done at the top. We're trying to affect the layout by using tables. So essentially what we want is a table that has 2 columns or 2 table data cells, and in each cell we have a separate table which itself has 2 rows and 2 columns. So the solution is essentially going to be a nested table. I'm going to make a little bit of space after the H3, and I'm going to create essentially the same structure as we've got up here. A new table that has a single row and 2 table data cells. This one and this one. Down here, I'm going to create a brand new table, and then I'm going to create a TR or a table row, and then I'm going to create 2 table cells. Now inside that first table data cell, I'm going to place our existing table. So I'm going to cut it and then I'm going to paste it in here. And then I'm going to grab another copy of this table and then I'm going to paste it into the second table data cell of the first level table. So right over here. Now this structure
Là đang làm table bên trong table ấy.
Biết rồi, biết rồi.
is a little bit confusing, and this is one of the reasons why using HTML to affect the layout is not a great idea. But by doing this exercise, you do get to grips with using tables, table rows, table datas, And if you've managed to complete this challenge, then you should understand the ins and outs of how to create tables using HTML. So now if we hit save and let's take a look at our work, you can see that we've got a single table with 2 tables nested inside, and we've managed to achieve this kind of structure. Now feel free to keep this layout or revert to the previous layout before the bonus challenge. It's completely up to you, or even design it however you like, with as many tables as you need. But I'm going to get rid of this nested table because it makes it really complicated to see at a glance what's going on. So I'm going to remove this top level table, and everything below this closing table tag I'm going to delete. And I'm going to get rid of some of that space. And we're back at where we were before the challenge, and I'll hit save to continue from here. Let's finish off by just giving our tables a little bit more spacing so that everything looks a little bit more spread out. So go ahead and add the cell spacing attribute to both of your tables and give it a value of, say, 10 pixels. Alright, so that's easy enough. We've done it before here. So we're going to add cell spacing equals 10 up here, and also in this table as well. Hit save. Let's check it out. Nice. Looks pretty good, right? And finally, let's add a few more horizontal rules. So let's add one between books and teaching and work experience, and also one between work experience and skills. Okay, so let's find the end of books and teaching, and let's add a horizontal rule here. Let's find the end of work experience, and let's add a horizontal rule here. Hit save, refresh. There we go. Bit more spacing. Everything looks a little bit more padded out. Alright, so if any of that was confusing or difficult, make sure that you watch the video again and also have a read of the MDN web docs on not just tables, but also T-head or T-body or T-foot or TD, THs, etc. So that you can have a look at the example code and see some other examples of how you can use tables and rows and cells. Now in the next lesson, we're going to learn all about HTML forms and how you can add these to your web page to collect data from your users. So all of that and more, see you on the next lesson. Alright, so I've added a few more details here and there to this personal site, and it's now really coming along and starting to look like a real website that you might come across browsing the web. Now the next thing that I want to do is when we go to the Contact Me page, it's a little bit sparse at the moment. It's only got my fictional address, my fictional number, and my fictional email. Now what if I could add a form at the end of this where I allow people to put down their name and their email, and they could message me using that form? How would we do that in HTML? So of course, first place to head to is the MDN web docs, and
Nó to anh Đức, mi nó nhỏ lắm.
Nó định làm gì đấy?
Thêm một cái bảng để mi điền vào ấy, mấy cái bảng để nhận input vào ấy.
Nhận input từ user, từ người khác đến thăm website.
we've got our form element. Now you can read through all of these attributes and start getting an understanding of how a form works and how you can put one together. Now, in order for forms to really come alive and to work as you would expect them to, it actually requires a little bit more than just HTML, because we need to specify the behavior of the form. We can design the form and we can structure the form for our website, but until we learn about JavaScript, we won't be able to tap into its full functionality just yet. But we can get pretty close. So let's go ahead and create a brand new form inside our contactme.html page. Just below the last paragraph tag, let's add a brand new form. And you can see that with the auto suggest, these are the default things that come up. Now I'm going to keep them as they are. We're going to go inside the form tag and we're going to create our first label. Now our first label is simply going to be called your name. So this is where we ask our user for their name input. And in order to store that information or allow them to type that information, we need to add an input. And the type of input is going to be text. So it's just going to be a text box that allows them to put in their name. And if we hit save and check out what our website looks like at the moment, then you can see we've got our label here. And we've got a box where somebody can type in some inputs. Now the thing that we're missing is a submit button. Now a submit button also falls under the inputs of a form. And you can see it right here. It's simply an input. Instead of having a type of text, it has the type of submit. And all you need to do is to change the word text to submit and delete the value attribute and hit save and refresh. You'll see that you get this submit button without having to put in any extra effort. So that's the beauty of some of these form inputs. And we can check out some of the other ones inside the docs by going to the related topics, and there's loads of different types of inputs. There's buttons, which are inputs, there's checkboxes, color, date. Let's give some of them a try and see what they look like on screen. Just before the submit button, let's add an input that has type maybe color. And of course, remember, you have to spell it the American way with a single O instead of OU. So let's hit save and refresh. And you can see we now have a color picker on our website. And when you click on it, it brings up the color picker where we can select any color we like. And you might submit a form that maybe has your favorite color or change the website using a color picker input. Another cool one is the checkbox. So we can add a checkbox by using input and changing text to checkbox. Hit save, hit refresh, and you can see we now have a little checkbox. So you can have a line break here, forcing this to go on to the next line. Let's create a label where it says, do you want to sign up to the email list? And hit save, refresh. And you can see you've got this classic checkbox. Do you want to sign up to the email list? Check or uncheck, and hit submit. Or you can put something like, have you read the terms and conditions, or any other thing that might fit with a checkbox. Now the last one that I wanted to show you before we proceed was the password input. So let's delete the checkbox and let's add a password input. The cool thing about the password input is that when you type anything inside this box, ideally you'd want a label, of course, here to show that this is the password. But we know this is a password field because you can either right-click and hit inspect, and you'll see that this is our password input, or you know that the next thing that comes after the password label is of course the password input. But whenever you type anything in here, by default, everything you type is masked. So these are for fields where you don't want somebody overlooking the user to be able to see what their password is. Feel free to have a bit of fun and try out all of these different input types and see what they look like and see what they do. And once you do that, you'll come to realize that a lot of the things that you see on the web are just very simple HTML inputs. And as we build our knowledge in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we're going to come back and see how forms work in more detail. So have an explore of that and see what they all look like when you just add them to your website. But we'll experience the full functionality a little bit later on. Now let's just quickly review what we've learned about HTML forms. We use the form tag to define what should go into our form. And this by itself doesn't actually do anything. So in order for the form to do anything, you'll need two important HTML elements, and that's the label and the input. And between the opening and closing label tags, you can write some text that will be displayed as a label inside your form. The next most important HTML element that's associated with forms are the inputs. and the input is a self-closing tag, so it doesn't have a closing tag. Instead, you can define the input type by using the type attribute, and there's a whole bunch of input types that you can tap into to use inside your form. For example, in this case, the type is set to text, so we get a text box where the user can input their name. But you can also use an input element that has the type attribute set as submit, and this creates a button. So you can see that by setting the attribute type to various predefined keywords, you actually end up with completely different things on your website. And it might seem strange that even though we're using the same HTML element, i.e. the input, we're actually getting completely different objects on our website. Anywhere from text boxes to buttons to color pickers and a myriad array of different things that we can create just by changing that type. Now, aside from just the text and submit input types, if you have a look at the MDN docs, you'll see that there's loads more different keywords that you can use. For example, the input type where you allow the user to upload a file, or the date picker, or the radio button, or a range. And you can see that I've only got static images in my slide to show you what they look like. But I want you to look through the MDN documentation for the input HTML element, and I want you to create a new HTML file that you're going to put onto your desktop, and you can open it in order to see it live in action. For example, the date picker now works and my range can be toggled. I can switch my radio button on. I can choose a file and a whole bunch of things. So use it as a living notebook, if you will. That should have been really easy, and just to quickly show you, this is what you could have created in order to achieve this. Now, at the moment, we're not yet looking into the other attributes for our form or for our inputs, and we're only changing the type attribute to some of these predefined keywords that you can see are listed on the MDN developer docs. In the next lesson, we'll look closer at how forms work and how you can capture and reveal what the user has chosen for each of the inputs. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now let's structure our form so that it looks like a proper contact form. So let's again add a horizontal rule to divide the top part from the bottom. And then in our form, we want a label that says your name. And then after that, we're going to get rid of this color, but we do want that line break. And then we've got a label that says password. Maybe we should ask them for your email. Maybe that'll help us get back in touch with them. And instead of password input type, we're going to change that to email. And to do that, I have to use something that's not actually an input. Instead, it's an HTML element called text area. So let's add a label first, and let's say your message. And text area has two attributes that are really important. One is the number of rows, and the other one's the number of columns. So rows determine how tall your text area should be, and columns determine how wide it should be on your web page. I'm going to stick to maybe 10 rows and 30 columns, but if we hit save, you'll see that it's actually something that you can modify. And I'm sure you've seen these text fields all over the internet. Anywhere where you have to put in a long answer, you'll get something that looks like a box, and you've got these few lines in the right corner. And what you can do is you can click and drag it to make that text field as large or as small as you want it to be. But the default, or the starting position, is defined by the developer. It's looking a little bit messy. Let's add a few more line breaks so that we can space things out a little bit and make it look a little bit more appealing. All right, so that looks a little bit nicer. I know it's still very bare bones, but at least it's starting to take shape. Now, the only problem is that at the moment, when you hit the submit button, what it does is that it'll take you back to your home page. And the reason is because when we created our form, it has this attribute called action, i.e. what should happen when you click submit. And at the moment, the action is simply take the user to the index.html page. And that is, of course, our home page. Now, without knowing anything about CSS or JavaScript, we can't actually get very deep into understanding what the method or the action means. But you kind of want it to have some basic functionality, right? Because otherwise it doesn't make any sense to anybody who's going onto our website. And even though this is our first website, it doesn't mean that it can't function or do something very simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the form action to a mail to. And what mail tos do is that when you press the submit button, they'll open up your default mail client. So that could be Mail on Mac, or it might go into Gmail if you're inside Chrome. And it puts in the email address that you specify after the colon here. And the post in this case simply means that we're going to transfer what the user types into these input fields into the email client. If we hit save, I'll show you what it looks like. So let's go to Contact Me, and let's give my name, my email, and my message. Now, if I hit submit, you can see that it opens up my mail app and adds a little bit of text into the body of the email. Now, it's not making too much sense right now. And in order to change that, we actually have to add a little bit more to our form. So I'm going to delete this class, and I'm going to add another attribute called encoding type. And this specifies, just as up here, we're specifying that our website is encoded in UTF-8. We're going to say that the data in our form is encoded in plain text. So that way, when it launches the mail app, you won't have these funny percentage signs and numbers. You'll instead just have plain text. Now, the other thing we need to add is a value to each of these name attributes, because that's going to identify the data that's inside each of these inputs. And I'll show you what I mean. So let's add the name as your name, second one, your email, and the third one, your message. All right, let's hit save, and let's go back to our website, hit refresh, and let's try it again. Now, I didn't show you this last time, but the cool thing about the email text field that we added here by changing the input type to email is that it does some basic validation. And that means if I type something like this and I try to hit enter, now it's a little bit different from browser to browser, but your browser might tell you that please include an @ in your email address, because all email addresses have @ right? And then it says, please enter a part following the @. All emails have something after the @. And it says emails don't contain these weird symbols, so you're probably not entering a correct email, or make sure that you check. So that's our email, but even though it's not a real email, it passes those basic validation checks. But we got all of those validation checks for free just by changing our input type to email. So it's already a pretty good deal. And later on, we'll show you how to make that validation a little bit more sophisticated. But it's already kind of cool that we have that. And then we'll add an email. So let's say, hey there again. And now hit submit. And you can see now, because we've added something to that name attribute, where we said your name, your email, your message, what we added here and here and here, now when we submit our form and we post this data that the user has inputted to our mail client, then it knows how to classify each bit of the data, i.e., this input should be labeled your name, this input should be labeled your email, and your message should be labeled like so. So this is a really, really basic little bit of functionality that we can get without yet understanding about JavaScript. So once you get to the JavaScript module, we're going to come back and revisit forms, and we're going to unleash the full power of HTML forms. But for now, this is a neat little bit of functionality that when we publish our website, it'll still work well enough for anybody who's actually coming onto our personal website or personal page. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to be launching into our intermediate HTML challenge. So we're going to be getting you to recreate a web page using all of the things that you've learned in this module. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.
Đấy, cái này là code trong đây luôn này. Quá đi.
Thế là xong và hết HTML hả?
Đâu, còn 3 cái nữa này. Đây là tip.
Thôi kệ, cứ xem này cũng được.
Now that we've completed the HTML section, and we have our completed website, but we can only access it locally because when we open up our index.html, you can see that we're just opening a local file, right? In this case, this file's inside my users folder, inside my username, inside my desktop. But that means nobody else can actually access this website, which makes it a bit pointless, right? The whole point of a website is so that we could put it onto the internet and everybody will be able to see our personal site or our CV. So how can we do this? Well, in order to do that, we need to host our website somewhere. Now, there's a whole bunch of hosting sites such as GoDaddy or Bluehost, but because we're learning at the moment, we don't want to have to pay for this. So there's also a free solution that I'm going to show you. By the end of this lesson, you're going to have your personal CV up on the internet, proudly displayed somewhere, and you'll be able to share a URL or a link to it so that anybody across the web can be able to access it. But first things first, we'll need to do a little bit of setup. The service that we're going to use is GitHub. And we're going to talk about GitHub in a lot of detail a little bit later on. It's a really, really useful tool that is pretty much essential to a developer's workflow. But for now, we're only going to use one of its features, which is hosting our website. So first and foremost, if you don't have a GitHub account, then you'll need to set up a new one.
Cái nào xài GitHub được?
Hình như chưa.
What? Vẫn có hết rồi.
Hình như bọn tao có nhưng mà chưa được dùng bao giờ.
So I'm just going to set one up while we're at it. And now it'll ask you to choose a plan. Now we're going to choose the free plan. And then we're going to click continue. Now I'm going to skip to Git,
Vẫn xài
so
GitHub rồi.
file link,
Đăng ký GitHub.
new, and this is simply just a files. And you'll be able to make changes then with a repository with a repository page that looks like this, which means that your repository has been created.
Tao đến đoạn này, tao đến
And
biết
the
dùng này.
only file that's in your repository is
Này á, đoạn này là tạo ấy. Tạo repo, cái này.
Mày chỉ xem mình cái này thôi nên mày tắt cái đó đi là không thấy gì cả.
Biết rồi, mày đang trên Windows. Đấy không? GitHub mình có mail trường đúng không? Có mail trường nên là có pro ấy. Đây. Thì đây là chỗ để up code lên thôi. À.
Up code xong lên share gì?
Xe là sao? Mình up code của mình lên thôi á.
Tao tưởng xe chung được. Xe người khác được.
Được trong người khác để vào làm chung ấy. Thì đây này, ví dụ đây là có cái code của WebJockey này, tao được share để vào làm chung này. Đấy. Thì người ta sẽ xem một cách là add member khác vào. Đấy. Muốn tạo cái code mới như bà hướng dẫn thì new này. Xong rồi tên này, mô tả này, add cái readme này, readme là cái để
Hướng dẫn cách sử dụng.
ở đây đấy, rồi add. Nhưng mà bà đang nói ở trong đây là cách để host cái host cái site của mình ấy, đưa cái site lên mạng ấy.
Biết mà.
Rồi up lên, up code lên này.
Mi chưa quay.
Rồi.
GitHub Pages. And GitHub Pages is designed to host your personal
GitHub thì có cái tính năng là GitHub Page này, thì nó sinh ra để mình có thể lên đây để host cái site của mình tạo ấy.
organization
Đặt
or
tạo cái
project
phần-
pages from a GitHub repository. So we already have the repository, we now have to activate our pages. So it's currently disabled. All we have to do to enable it, we just have to select a source where our files reside. So if you click on this part where it says none, you should change it to where it says master branch and go ahead and click save. So now GitHub is going to do some behind the scenes stuff, and it's going to be publishing towards a place which is going to be your username.github.io/your project name. So that will be your CV. And you can see this is a HTTPS website, so you'll be able to access this site from anywhere across the world as long as you're connected to the internet. Now, this publishing process takes a little while. So if you refresh this page, you'll see that it says your site is published at this address. And if you click on that address, you should be able to see your website show up. Now, if at this point what you see instead is a 404, then that just means that you have to be a little bit more patient. The GitHub servers are probably working overtime, and come back in maybe half an hour and check that link again. But once you are done though, then your website should work exactly as it did locally. But now you can go ahead and share this link with anybody you like across the world, and they can access it because it's now hosted on the internet. So you can go ahead and go over to angelbauer.github.io/CV, and you too will be able to see this website that I've just uploaded and I'm looking at right now. So now it's time for you to go through this process and upload your CV and your website onto the World Wide Web, and be sure to share a link to your project in the Q&A of this lesson so that we can all admire your hard work and what you have created. So that's all from me for this lesson. I'll see you on the next.
Đây là hết HTML này. Thì có muốn ngồi code không hay là học tiếp?